So a quick introduction then before we get into Vanessa's presentation. And I'd like to just provide a little news update on what's been going on within the state in relation to climate change and emissions. So it's been a pretty big month, and I'm sure Brad can attest to that. We've had a couple of significant announcements. So on the 14th of June, it was announced by the state government that they would be closing in 2027 and 2029, respectively, the two state-owned coal-fired power stations which support the Southwest electricity system. So that's the Collie Power Station and the Muja D Power Station. Together, those power stations, it's estimated, represent about 40% of the emissions of the Swiss. So it's quite a significant step that those power stations will be closed. That was then followed up by an announcement just last week that the state government is setting an 80% reductions target on its own emissions, so the whole of government emissions, by 2030. Significant steps forwards. I just want to put them in context of the state's emissions overall, so we're all on the same page about what that actually means. So overall, give or take a few million, the state government emissions in 2019 were about 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent, not accounting for changes in land use. The figures for 2020 have just been released. Larissa, you posted them a couple of days ago. Including land use, it's gone down to 81 million, but 2020 was a bit of a funny year, and so on. Stick with 100 million because it's an easy number to remember. And those emissions are spread across a range of different industries and activities. For example, oil and gas extraction is just about the largest, followed by the electricity sector, the industrial sector, manufacturing, residential, commercial, agricultural, etc. And you can see there that electricity generation is a pretty large chunk. It's about a quarter of emissions overall. If we take away all the coal-fired power within the electricity grid, that takes away about 7 million tons. So that's not just the announced closures, but that's also the closure of the privately owned coal-fired power station at Blue Waters as well. But that only actually looks like that. And the reason it doesn't quite reflect the 40% I mentioned earlier for total grid emissions is only about half the electricity-associated emissions are actually coming from the grid itself in the southwest. The rest is associated with the generation of electricity in other parts of the state, predominantly up north, supporting industries like mining, oil and gas extraction, etc. So when we talk about that closure of the coal-fired power stations, it's an important step forward, and it's government providing leadership, which is fantastic, but it's only the very, very beginning of what we really, really need to do.
So next you said 7%?
It's 7 million tons if you stack up the coal-fired emissions from last year. Yeah, that's from OpenNEM, is where I got that. And there are challenges, of course, even with just making that change. So those who know a little bit about the electricity system will know if you take away the consistent power which is generated by a coal-fired power plant, you've got to replace that consistency in the system somehow. And if you don't get that right, and you mismatch supply and demand of electricity, well, then the lights start going out, which is an easy thing to talk about, but you kind of have to experience it to realize quite what a big impact that actually has on our everyday lives. 2 weeks ago, where I live in West Perth, there was a power cut for 2.5 hours in the afternoon. And this is a picture that my wife took in the supermarket. She had to abandon that trolley of stuff because the tills couldn't take payment. I was driving around at the time. All the traffic lights were out. The junctions were actually quite terrifying as everyone was trying to weave their way through. And in fact, an hour after that, I was walking somewhere else and I saw the aftermath of a crash. So that was just 2.5 hours without power. And if we don't get this right and you move that to half day, a day, a week without power, that's a really big challenge, which is going to very rapidly lose people's faith in the need to decarbonise. So we need to be very careful about how we do this. The interesting thing about that power cut is it was literally nothing to do with climate change or anything like that. It was a foil balloon which was caught on a transmission line. But it shows the fragility of our energy system. There are opportunities, of course, associated with decarbonisation as well. And I think it's really important that we think about those, particularly in the context of what we might achieve here. Steelmaking is something that I've been thinking and posting about a bit recently. Steel accounts for between 7 and 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So steel manufacture is a really carbon-intensive process. That's partly because you need lots of heat to go into it, but also because coal is a chemical input into the steel manufacture of steel as well. So that's a significant challenge how you solve that problem. Now, there are technology solutions out there. Most of the most promising ones involve inputting quite a lot of renewable power and lots of green hydrogen, which has been produced by renewable power. So then you start thinking about, well, what are the best places in the world to generate large amounts of cheap renewable power close to the iron ore which you want to create the steel from? Start thinking about where we fit into that picture. This is quite a complicated diagram, but the key thing to point out is that these items which are green, those little green tags, are the parts of the world which offer the lowest cost renewable electricity and hydrogen. And green means it's commercially viable to produce green steel based on that. So we've got West Africa, South Africa, and Australia. But Australia is by far the one with the largest iron ore deposits. So if you want to be taking your renewable energy, converting it to hydrogen, which is then very difficult to move around, and combining it somewhere with iron ore coming straight out the ground, there aren't many better places than in WA, and that's a massive opportunity for us. If, though, you've got a company which is a consumer of that steel, so I think about ships, because I'm from a shipbuilding background, they will be very interested in that steel being identical in every way to the steel which is produced by a conventional process. So the product has to be exactly the same. So why would they buy ours, not potentially cheaper Chinese steel, which has been produced via the conventional process? In fact, that's the problem that you face as a consumer as well. If you're walking around the supermarket and you're choosing between two different shampoos or steaks or whatever it is, why choose one over the other if the functional product is exactly the same? And the answer is in this intangible quality associated with these products, which are the emissions which are created in their manufacture. But the trouble is you can't see that. So we need a chain that we can trust, which takes us from the measurement and the recording of the emissions in the produce of a service or product that we use, right the way through to our purchase of that product. And when you start thinking about the emissions which are associated with all these different products and services we use, and you start to really educate yourself on it, I find that you have this totally different view of the world where you see it for what it really is, and the illusion that everything is the same drops away before your eyes. So I like to think it's a little bit like the Matrix, and suddenly you're seeing all the numbers absolutely everywhere. I think one of the reasons that I was keen to hear from Vanessa tonight, other than the incredible and interesting personal journey that you've been on to get to where you are, is because you're part of creating that visibility of emissions. So helping us all understand what are the numbers that should be on every single item that we see around us. So Vanessa, very looking forward to hearing from you, and I will hand over to you.